EVO.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey everybody, so today we're going to do episode 2 in our 3-part series on Halloween. Hi, I'm Bruce.
And I'm Jeff. Welcome to Taboo Treasures, a weekly podcast that explores the human obsession with objects of extreme rarity and infamy.
Today's episode, the good, the bad, and the dead. So we're pretty used to bad behavior during presidential elections, but the 1828 presidential race between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams really stands out. The previous election that Jackson lost to Adams was controversial, so there was already a lot of tension when the campaign started.
And when the polls opened on October 31st, Jackson's people smeared Adams as a nasty aristocrat who was misusing tax funds and what he called a corrupt bargainer. Meanwhile, Adams was hitting Jackson back for his gambling and dueling, and his opponents tried to portray him and his wife, Rachel, as adulterers, which at the time apparently meant more than it does today.
Yeah, Jackson won big, but the election became an important template in more ways than one. Not only was it the first election where most states chose which candidate they endorsed, but all the nastiness introduced America to political campaigning and played a huge role in defining the country's political parties.
In 1854, Congress admitted Nevada as the 36th state on Halloween. But it was a special case because one of the requirements of statehood was a population of at least 60,000, and Nevada only had about 40,000.
So why did Congress make an exception? If you guessed money, you nailed it. A massive silver deposit called the Comstock Lode had recently been discovered there, but getting it out of the ground required big investments in special equipment. So a lot of the rich and powerful guys who were willing to invest in mining were suddenly very interested in bringing Nevada into the Union.
Yeah, and meanwhile, this was around the end of the Civil War when Lincoln was working on the 13th Amendment, and he was motivated to get statehood for Nevada for a bunch of reasons. For one thing, he didn't want the Confederacy to get their hands on it, but he also wanted those 3 electoral votes. Nevada wanted in, so it had Lincoln's back, but they were under the gun to get it done, so they put together and sent the entire proposed Nevada state constitution to D.C. in the longest telegram ever sent. Can you imagine ... Yeah,
it was a wild move at the time because it was about 200 pages. But it paid off with Congress approving it almost immediately. Nevada became a state, the rich got richer, and 3 months later to the day, Congress approved the 13th Amendment. Known as the last great cavalry charge, in 1914, Australia got involved in the Great War, World War I, because it was a member of the British Empire when Britain declared war on Germany in August of that year. Tens of thousands of Australian men enlisted to fight. The men of the brigade were not professional soldiers, they were stockmen, farmers, and bushmen accustomed to outdoor life, and they were excellent horsemen.
But the brigade wasn't trained or equipped for the type of full frontal cavalry charge that they planned for Beersheba in the Negev Desert. Beersheba was held by the Ottoman Turks, and they were worried that using that kind of tactic against entrenched positions defended by machine guns and artillery could be a disaster.
But around 4:30 p.m. on Halloween in 1917, nearly 800 horsemen slowly moved towards the Ottomans. At first they moved at a trot, then a canter, and finally about a mile from Beersheba, they broke into full gallop. The Ottomans had been expecting another slow push by infantry, not a fast, relentless charge by mounted troops. On the top of that, the sun was low in the western sky, so it was in their eyes and it made it hard for them to aim accurately.
The brigade got to the trenches so fast that the Ottomans couldn't even lower their artillery to accurately fire at the charging horsemen. The whole thing lasted barely an hour, and it was an unqualified success. The brigade lost only 31 men with 36 wounded. The victory at Beersheba marked a major turning point in the Sinai and Palestine campaigns because it helped the British to finally break the Ottoman line near Gaza.
That in turn paved the way for further advances into Palestine, including the capture of Jerusalem in December 1917, which was an important win for the Allies.
Halloween in 1933 is a story with rough beginnings but a pretty happy ending. The Great Depression wasn't just about money. The people themselves were depressed, and everywhere you looked there was hopelessness and despair.
Even Halloween had sort of become a reflection of the times. Pranks were getting less benign, the streets were meaner, there was no candy, so the trick part of the night started to take over. Halloween was getting more and more ugly, and then, on Halloween in 1933, all the pent-up frustration, fear, and uncertainty came to a violent head.
All over the country, teenagers were flipping over cars, sawing down telephone poles, and starting fires. It got so bad it became known as Black Halloween after Black Tuesday, the day the markets crashed and started the Depression. Some cities even considered banning Halloween altogether, but then something surprising emerged from the wreckage of that night.
Over the next few years, Halloween began to change, with less acting out and more kid-friendly activities. There was more focus on costume and candies, and the tricks became sillier and more gentle pranks like wrapping a tree in toilet paper and hiding plastic spiders in kids' candy bags. Not sure where the egging thing came from, but they definitely wouldn't be throwing food at houses during the Depression.
Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks of the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
This one isn't on Halloween exactly, but it happened the night before, so it was Halloween somewhere. It was 1938, so you have to appreciate that the only way people got news and information were newspapers and radio. That meant that breaking news was strictly radio and word of mouth.
CBS was doing its regular radio stuff when all of a sudden the news broke in with a blaring special report that Martians have invaded New Jersey and about 12 million people around the country broke out in mass hysteria. Of course it wasn't an alien invasion. Oh, bummer. It was a radio play that CBS went along with called War of the Worlds. It was the brainchild of a group of radio actors led by the legendary Orson Welles. And by the time it was revealed, about 1 million people freaked out in panic and ran screaming out of their homes thinking the Earth was about to be overrun by Martians.
Imagine if someone did that today, right? In about a nanosecond, every conspiracy theorist on the planet would be clambering down into their prepper shelters and locking themselves into panic rooms, and everyone would be screaming about Democrats and Republicans and terrorists and trans athletes. Even when it turned out to be a hoax, it'd probably give birth to about 1 million YouTube videos that would stay up forever about how it really happened and the government is hiding it from us.
Yes, they are. What's kind of funny is that it really did happen in a way. There's been conspiracy theories about aliens for decades, starting with the granddaddy of them all, Area 51 in Roswell, New Mexico, where the government has a whole top-secret collection of alien spacecraft and, of course, actual aliens.
Right, and that seemed kind of ridiculous until you remember that these are the same people who still think JFK is alive and he's going to come to Dallas, where his fake assassination was staged, to be Trump's running mate. Now, JFK would be 108 years old, but there's probably an explanation for that, too.
Oh, yeah. The best thing about aliens is how many great movies were made about aliens. So, Jeff, what's your favorite alien movie?
That's That's a tough one, but I'm going to say The Day the Earth Stood Still. From the time I saw that as a kid, I don't think it's ever been topped. What about you?
I mean, I'm about E.T. and Independence Day. I like all the crazy ones, and of course, there's Aliens.
Yeah, there's so many great ones. It's hard to pick a favorite.
Sigourney Weaver as Beaver. Yes.
Did you just say Sigourney Weaver as Beaver?
No, you can see her pubes above her underwear in that movie.
Is that why it's your favorite movie?
Yeah, it's not my favorite, but it's a good one.
This one's Halloween of 1941, and it's a little bit more obscure. Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills of Keystone, South Dakota, is of course one of the most famous landmarks in the world, but those gigantic 60-foot granite faces of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln almost never happened.
The South Dakota state historian in the 1920s, Dwayne Robinson, came up with the idea. It was overseen by the U.S. Department of Interior, which is responsible for what we have no idea. But anyway, they let Robinson hire an American sculptor named Gustav Borglum.
Borglum's resume was already pretty impressive. He'd led the giant carving of 3 Confederate figures, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, on Stone Mountain in Georgia. It's still there, but as you can imagine, it's not exactly loved by all. He also did the Lincoln bust that's still in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda and other monuments and memorials, so he was a natural for the job.
So then Robinson got some other state big shots on board, and they convinced Congress to support the project, and by 1925, it was a go. After a couple years of planning, Borglum started the bonkers task of reshaping an entire mountain. The original idea was that the sculpture would depict the presidents from the waist up, but Borglum died in 1941 when we were about to slam into World War II, so there wasn't much incentive to keep the project going, and it almost ended.
But instead of pulling the plug, they decided to scale down the plans and just carve the busts. It turned out that Borglum's son was also a sculptor, and he'd helped his father along the way, so they hired him to finish up. And a few months after his father, Gutzon, died, his son, who was actually named Lincoln, finished what his father had started.
The Rushmore National Memorial was unveiled on Halloween of 1941. But if you ever wondered why the Washington part of the statue sort of has clothes and Lincoln's head is barely peeking out of the mountainside, it's because after Gutzon died and the war started, it was never really finished the way it was intended.
Rushmore is still the biggest and most famous memorial in the country by far, and if our current president has his way, it'll definitely be the dumbest one.
The first black football player in the NFL was Fritz Pollard. He played for the Akron Pros in 1920, the league's first season. Pollard wasn't only a player but also a coach, and he made significant contributions to football during a time of racial segregation.
And Jackie Robinson, of course, became the first black baseball player in the major leagues on April 15, 1947, when he debuted with the Brooklyn Dodgers. His entry into the league not only transformed baseball, but also played a significant role in the civil rights movement in the U.S.
But believe it or not, the NBA was all white until 1950, when on Halloween night, Earl Lloyd played his first game with the Washington Capitals, scoring 6 points.
The NBA draft that year, 1950, was the first to include black players, but Lloyd wasn't the first. Chuck Cooper was actually picked in the second round, 13th overall by the Boston Celtics, and Nate Clifton was drafted by the New York Knicks and became the first black man to sign a contract.
Because of NBA scheduling, Lloyd was the first black man to actually play a game in the NBA. He eventually played in more than 560 games in 9 seasons. But at first, he only played 7 games for the Washington Capitals because the team folded on January 9th in 1951.
And then he was drafted and fought in Korea. While he was still in the Army, the Syracuse Nationals picked him up on waivers. He came back to basketball in 1952, and in the 1953-54 season, he led the NBA in both personal fouls and disqualifications. He must have picked up some bad habits in Korea.
But in the 1954-55 season, he averaged a career high of 10.2 points and 7.7 rebounds and helped Syracuse beat the Fort Wayne Pistons 4-3 to win the 1955 NBA championship. It was just dumb luck for us that his first game was on Halloween.
The Cultural Revolution of the 60s has been covered pretty well by now, But sometimes we forget that with all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or as it's known, the good part, and despite the fact that the hippie movement was perceived by straight society as an unserious bunch of children who needed to get haircuts and collared shirts, the anti-war protests of the 60s did influence the U.S. government.
And it wasn't just the young ones in the streets. The music, film, and the art revolution were all part of the cultural upheaval and all played crucial roles in the movement. On Halloween in 1968, Lyndon Johnson stopped bombing Vietnam. He was also responsible for unprecedented civil rights legislation, and the jury's still out on some of it. But he implemented the Voting Rights Act that stopped discrimination practices like literacy tests that dramatically increased black voter registration, and he appointed Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, the first black justice in history.
Yeah, that's pretty good, but you know what's great? He used to take in-person meetings while he was sitting on the toilet with the door open. He would take it, this is true, he'd take in-person meetings while he was in the shower, and then he'd get out and just keep the meeting going while he dried off.
I guess he nicknamed his dick Jumbo.
Apparently, yeah.
And of course, he had a Fresca button installed on his desk in the Oval Office. And I guess everyone hated him.
Yeah.
RFK used to call him and his wife Rufus and the pork chop.
Come to think of it, maybe he wasn't so different from our current president, except, for the Fresca button, it's Diet Coke now. But it is worth repeating. He stopped the bombing of Vietnam in 1968.
So we just spoke about some of the good things that happened on Halloween, but now we're going to talk about some of the bad things that happened on Halloween. On October 31st in 1837, hundreds of Native American Muskogee Creek tribe died along with a fireman and the barkeep in the Monmouth steamboat disaster.
The physical cause could be written off as an accident, but the fact is the reason such a tragedy was even possible was already linked to an ongoing genocide, the Trail of Tears. The Monmouth was a Mississippi River paddle wheel boat that collided with another steamer and the ship it was towing, called the Trenton. The Monmouth and the Trenton both sank in minutes.
Somewhere between 300 and 400 Muskogee died that night, while being yanked from their ancestral homeland in the southern United States to the Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. No government agency ever investigated the crash, and there aren't many records because they were all Muskogee and nobody cared.
Yeah. Benito Mussolini's political insurrection in Italy culminated on Halloween of October 31st, 1922, when thousands of his followers in black fascist party shirts stormed the Piazza del Quirinale in Rome. That night became known as the March on Rome, and it was the night that Mussolini officially took power and became the Prime Minister of Italy and later the dictator.
Italy has had 30 different prime ministers since then, and now, 103 years after Mussolini took power, Italy once again has a fascist prime minister, Giorgia Meloni of the Brothers of Italy party. Most of us associate the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor with the first sinking of an American ship during World War II, but in reality, it happened just over a month earlier.
Yeah, right before we formally entered the war, the Navy had been using our ships to escort British ships who were ferrying supplies from the German submarines that were targeting them. The Reuben James, a Clemson-class destroyer, was part of an escort convoy between Iceland and Great Britain when, tragically, a German U-boat hit it with a torpedo and sank it. Of 150 crew on board, only 44 survived. It was Halloween 1941.
It was an historical event, but it went mostly unnoticed by the public, especially after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But one notorious folk artist, Woody Guthrie, was taking notes, and he immortalized it in a song called The Sinking of the Reuben James.
Have you heard of a ship called the Good Reuben James? Manned by hard-fighting men, both of honor and fame. She flew the stars and stripes of this land.
On Halloween in 1963, a Holiday on Ice show was doing its Mardi Gras season finale for an indoor audience of about 4,300 people at the Indianapolis State Fairground Coliseum. It was a big production with an 18-piece band and fireworks. No one knew that all during the show, a huge tank below the crowd had been leaking huge amounts of propane into the closed-roof auditorium.
When that cloud of propane reached a commissary heating element, it set off an explosion that thundered through the auditorium with a 30-foot wall of flame. People blasted out of their seats, and slabs of concrete the size of small cars went up 50 feet and rained down on the crowd, crushing dozens and trapping many more in tons of debris. Then the flooring caved in and left a massive crater.
People who hadn't been killed by the explosion of flying debris scrambled for their lives. Some of them slipping and sliding across the ice, others were slipping and sliding over blood. By the time it was over, 400 people had been injured, many critically, and 74 people had been killed.
An Indianapolis Star reporter who covered the disaster named Richard R. Roberts said, "You walked into a nightmare. This is the worst thing I've seen since combat in World War II."
On Halloween in 1999, Egyptian Air Flight 990 from Los Angeles to Cairo crashed into the ocean in such shocking circumstances that officials still can't agree how it happened. It was cruising at about 33,000 feet, and everything seemed to be going fine until it started basically dropping out of the sky about 1:50 a.m.
At about 16,000 feet, it came out of its dive and started climbing again. Then it got to about 25,000 feet, but it changed direction, lost an engine, and went screaming into the ocean.
According to cockpit voice recordings, the captain took a bathroom break and the co-pilot took over. A couple minutes later, the autopilot was disabled and the plane started descending so suddenly and fast that it almost reached the speed of sound, and the conditions in the plane would have simulated zero gravity.
So combined with some of the dialogue on that recorder, the NTSB came to the conclusion that the co-pilot caused the crash, but the Egyptian authorities never really agreed. 217 people were killed, 14 crew and 203 passengers, including a group of Egyptian military personnel who were on their way home from a joint training exercise.
So what's your favorite song or jam on Halloween? Tell us about it at Taboo Treasures on Instagram and TikTok.
Or you can email us at tabootreasures@evocreative.com.
So we've talked about good things on Halloween, and we've talked about bad things on Halloween, but now we're going to talk about the dead on Halloween. As most of you know, Harry Houdini was a legendary illusionist who became the most famous escape artist in the world. In 1926, when he was teaching students in Montreal a series of tricks, he bragged that his stomach muscles were so strong that he could take any punch to the midsection.
So a student named Jocelyn Gordon Whitehead took him up on it and gave him a few heavy body shots, but Houdini wasn't ready. Even so, he said he was fine, but not long after that, he started complaining of pain in his stomach. He still managed to get through one final performance, but right after the curtain, he collapsed.
He died shortly after on Halloween of 1926. The lore is that the punches killed him, but it turned out that he had a ruptured appendix. So when doctors attributed his pain to the punches, he didn't bother going to the hospital, and it was probably a case of really bad timing.
And one of the rumors that hasn't gone away is he was murdered by a pseudo-religious group that called itself the Spiritualists because he debunked them, but no one really knows for sure, and no, I don't think anyone believes that crap.
American football as we know it today probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for George Halas. Not only was he the owner of the Chicago Bears, but he was also one of the founders of the National Football League and one of the most successful coaches of all time.
He saw the league develop over 50 years, and he was an icon of football in Chicago. He's one of the men who kept football alive when players still traveled by bus or trolley car and got paid by the game, and he was still around in the post-war era when football was first televised.
At the time, Halas was the oldest person in NFL history to be a head coach at 72 years and 318 days when he coached his final game of his career in 1967. Papa Bear, as they called him, died in Chicago on Halloween in 1983 at the age of 88.
Nothing shakes up the global population like a major political assassination, and assassinations are pretty rarely followed by an era of peace and understanding.
The assassination of the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, on October 31st, 1984, did kick off a period of brutal violence. She was murdered by her own bodyguards as retribution for her actions against the Sikh population, and backlash from the act led to a massacre of thousands of Sikh people in the Indian capital and throughout the country.
On October 31st, 1991, Broadway literally went dark the day after Joseph Papp died. Papp was one of the most influential producers in the history of American theater.
He founded the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1954 because he wanted to make Shakespeare's work accessible to the public. In 1957, the city gave him the use of Central Park so he could put on Shakespeare's productions for free.
He also converted the Astor Library into the public theater in the 1960s, where plays like Hair and A Chorus Line made their debuts. He died of prostate cancer in his Greenwich Village home at the age of 70.
River Phoenix began his acting career in TV commercials when he was only 10 years old. His early film roles include Explorers in 1985 and Stand By Me in 1986, as well as The Mosquito Coast. When he made the transition into adult-oriented roles, he got nominated for an Academy Award in 1988 for Best Supporting Actor for the Sidney Lumet film Running on Empty.
One night while he was on a break from filming a movie called Dark Blood, he and his girlfriend Samantha Mathis, his brother Joaquin, and his sister Rain went to the Viper Room, which at that time was co-owned by Johnny Depp.
The night ended in tragedy when Phoenix took a cocktail of drugs and went downhill fast. He started having seizures outside the club. Rain tried to help him, and Joaquin called 911. But paramedics couldn't revive him at the scene, and Phoenix never recovered. He was declared dead in the early hours of October 31st at the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center.
His official cause of death was listed as acute multiple drug intoxication, but basically it was a lethal overdose of morphine and coke, and he was only 23 years old.
And that same night, more than 6,000 miles away in Rome, the great Italian director Federico Fellini died at 73.
Fellini's storytelling transcended language barriers. He won 4 Academy Awards for Best Foreign Language Film for La Strada in 1956, and again the next year for The Knights of Cabiria in 1957. He won it again for 8 1/2 in 1963, and again for Amarcord in 1974.
In 1993, the Academy called him one of the screen's master storytellers and gave him an honorary Academy Award. Sadly, that year, on October 17th, he had a heart attack, and by the end of the month, he also had high fever and kidney issues. He passed away in Rome on Halloween in 1993.
So that was the bad, the good, and the dead, and we're going to lighten up a little bit at the end here with some music. The first one is Werewolves of London. So Phil Everly of the Everly Brothers and Warren Zevon were in a session in 75. And Everly told Zevon about a 1935 movie he'd just seen called Werewolves of London. He said as a joke that he should write a song about it.
But the artists involved were no joke. Zevon, Leroy Marinell, and Waddy Wachtel wrote it in about 15 minutes, and they got Jackson Browne to produce it. Brown also got 2 members of Fleetwood Mac on the track, Mick Fleetwood on drums, and John McVie on bass, with Wachtel on guitar and Zevon on piano and vocals.
It was released on March of 78, and it reached number 21 on the Billboard charts.
Who you gonna call?
Ghostbusters.
Ghostbusters was the theme song for the movie Ghostbusters in 1984. It was written and performed by Ray Parker Jr., and it went to number 1 on the Billboard charts. And it was nominated for Best Original Song at the 57th Academy Awards.
But was it original? Shortly after the film came out, Huey Lewis of Huey Lewis and the News sued Ray Parker for plagiarism. He said that Parker copied the melody from his 1983 song, I Want a New Drug.
The filmmakers admitted to using it as temporary background music in a lot of scenes. Okay, that's how it happened. And the case was settled out of court in 1985, but the amount wasn't publicized.
And of course, the Michael Jackson single Thriller, which was written by a guy named Rod Temperton. It was produced by the one and only Quincy Jones. It was released in 1982 and reached number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100, went platinum, and sold over 4 million copies. There were 7 more top 10 singles on the Thriller album, and after 43 years, it's still the biggest selling album of all time.
And Monster Mash, written by Bobby Pickett and Lenny Capizzi and sung by Pickett, was released in August of 1962 and went to number 1 on the Billboard charts. It sold over 1 million copies at the time, and it's played so often it still generates about $1 million a year in royalties. I wish I wrote that song.
My God. Can you imagine any of these songs on this list? Think about it. Werewolves of London, Ghostbusters.
Yeah. But the Monster Mash one is great because it was written so long ago and it still generates that kind of income.
Well, and also it was a novelty song at the time.
Right.
And nobody could have possibly imagined it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that wraps up part 2 of our 3-part Halloween series.
Thanks for listening, and if you want to communicate with us or talk to us and tell us how shitty or great we're doing, you can reach out to us at Taboo Treasures on Instagram and TikTok.
Or you can email us at tabootreasures@evocreative.com.
And please stay tuned next week for our last episode in the Halloween series. It's all about the movie Halloween. Bye-bye. From EVO, Taboo Treasures is produced by Bruce Witkin and Jeff Levine. Executive producer Brandon Morgan. Music by the Lonely Bulls.